It was a quiet afternoon in Arlington, Texas, a typical Tuesday in 1996. The sky was clear, the streets calm, and life moved at an unhurried pace. The Pear Tree apartment complex stood among the suburban landscape, a seemingly ordinary place where people came home to relax after long work days. But inside one of those apartments, a horrific crime was about to unfold, shattering the peace of this small community. Christine Vu was just 25 years old. A bright, dedicated school teacher, she had always known she wanted to work with children. Her passion for education was evident in the way she taught, patient, kind, always looking for creative ways to engage her students. Christine was more than just a teacher. She was an inspiration to those around her. She had a steady boyfriend, a close-knit group of friends, and a family who adored her. To the people who knew her, she was full of life, ambition, and warmth. That evening, her boyfriend tried calling her, but there was no answer. At first, he assumed she was busy. Maybe she had stepped out or fallen asleep, but as the hours passed, concern set in. Something didn't feel right. He decided to drive over to her apartment, hoping to ease his worries. But when he arrived and knocked on the door, there was no response. The uneasy feeling in his stomach only grew stronger. The police were soon called, and when officers entered Christine's apartment, they were met with a chilling scene. In the bathroom, submerged in the bathtub, lay Christine's lifeless body. Her hands and feet were bound with duct tape. She had been stripped of her clothing, her dignity, and ultimately, her life. The cause of death was clear. She had been strangled. The brutality of the crime sent shivers down the spines of the officers on the scene. Detective Ed Featherston, a seasoned investigator with the Arlington Police Department, took the lead on the case. Right away, something about the crime scene felt disturbingly meticulous. There were no signs of forced entry, no immediate indication of a struggle beyond the bathroom. Then, a critical clue emerged. Fingerprints were found on the interior deadbolt lock, which could only be engaged from inside the apartment. This meant that whoever had murdered Christine had locked the door before leaving, ensuring no one would discover the crime too soon. The fingerprints were sent for analysis, but there was no immediate match. Christine's killer had no criminal record, no documented presence in any law enforcement database. He was a ghost. Without any solid leads, the case gradually went cold. Christine's family was left devastated. They had lost a daughter, a sister, a friend. Her students, many too young to fully understand what had happened, felt the void left by her absence. The town mourned her, but the grief was mixed with fear. A murderer was out there, and no one knew who he was. For months, the case remained stagnant. But just when the town of Arlington was beginning to move forward, tragedy struck again. It was Christmas Eve, a time for families to come together, to celebrate, to share laughter and love. Brenda Norwood and her family were in the kitchen, preparing for the evening's festivities when the phone rang. On the other end was her niece, sounding worried. "I haven't been able to get in touch with Wendy." Wendy Prescott, just 22 years old, had been expected at the family gathering. She wasn't the type to disappear without a word. As the night dragged on and there was still no sign of her, Brenda and her husband knew something was wrong. They decided to check on her, making the short drive to her apartment. The Pear Tree apartment complex was eerily quiet when they arrived. They climbed the stairs, their concern growing with each step. Brenda knocked on the door. No answer. A cold dread settled in her chest. When the door was pushed open, the apartment appeared normal at first. Nothing seemed out of place. But then, in the bathroom, their worst fears were realized. Wendy Prescott was dead. Naked, face down in the bathtub, bound in the same cruel manner as Christine Vu. The horror of the moment was indescribable. Her body was eerily still, her hands clenched into fists as if she had fought against the inevitable. Brenda gasped in disbelief, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing. When Detective Tommy Lenoir arrived at the scene, a terrible sense of déjà vu washed over him. Everything was the same. The layout of the apartment, the positioning of the furniture, even the floral wallpaper in the bathroom. It was as if time had rewound and replayed the nightmare, and that's when he knew they were dealing with a serial killer. The similarities between the two murders were chilling. The way both women were restrained, the use of duct tape, the water in the bathtub, the method of strangulation. This wasn't the work of a random attacker. This was someone who planned, who controlled every aspect of his crime. And he was still out there. But this time, he had left behind more evidence. Investigators found a fingerprint pressed into the dust of Wendy Prescott's TV stand. It was clear, almost perfect. They also recovered semen from the crime scene. Two critical pieces of evidence. But neither could immediately reveal the identity of the killer. Over 200 suspects were questioned, their fingerprints analyzed, their alibis checked. One by one, they were ruled out. The case stretched on for years with no arrests. The families of Christine and Wendy lived in agony, unable to move on, unable to find peace. And then, science changed everything. A revolutionary new fingerprint analysis system, known as IAFIS, was developed by the FBI. Unlike older systems, this one could rotate a fingerprint 360 degrees, detecting unique identifiers that had previously been missed. Investigators decided to run the dust print from Wendy Prescott's apartment through the system. 2 weeks later, they had a match: Dale Devon Chionette. For Detective Lenoir, the moment was surreal. He had stared at that fingerprint for years. Now, it had a name attached to it. Chionette had once lived in the Pertree Apartments, but at the time of the murders, he had no criminal record. That changed in 1999 when he was arrested for burglary. His fingerprints had been entered into the system, and now they had come back to haunt him. Investigators pulled out the latent fingerprint from Christine Vu's apartment. They compared it to Chionette. A match. Not only had he been in Wendy Prescott's apartment, he had been in Christine Vu's as well. The walls were closing in. When police confronted Chionette, he denied everything. He refused to provide a DNA sample and refused to acknowledge the evidence against him. But the forensic proof was overwhelming. DNA analysis confirmed that the semen found at both crime scenes belonged to him. On January 8, 2003, Dale Devon Chionette was found guilty of capital murder. His punishment? Death. For years, he sat on death row, filing appeal after appeal. But on February 10, 2009, at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville, justice was finally served. Dale Devon Chionette was executed by lethal injection. For the families of Christine Vu and Wendy Prescott, there was no joy in his death, only the cold satisfaction of knowing he would never hurt anyone again. The wounds of their loss would never fully heal, but they could at least close this chapter of their grief. And for the town of Arlington, a nightmare had finally come to an end. Justice was served, but no verdict, no execution, could bring back Christine Vu or Wendy Prescott. Their families will forever carry the weight of their loss, their lives forever changed by the actions of a predator who stole so much from them. Yet, their fight for justice ensured that their loved ones were never forgotten. The relentless pursuit of truth by law enforcement, combined with the advancements of forensic science, proved that no matter how long it takes, justice can and will be found. Cases like this remind us of the importance of staying vigilant, of using technology to its fullest potential in solving crimes, and of never giving up on those who can no longer speak for themselves.
On a cold evening in early March 1979, 31-year-old Catherine Donahghue, affectionately known as Kathy, joined a few of her coworkers for a casual dinner in Washington, D.C. It was a simple gathering, nothing out of the ordinary. There was no occasion to celebrate, no big plans on the horizon, just a quiet meal among colleagues after a day's work. Kathy had made a new life for herself in the D.C. area, having moved from Allentown, Pennsylvania, where she was born in 1948. Outgoing and kind, she had settled in Arlington, Virginia, and was working as a secretary, embracing her independence and adulthood with quiet confidence. By the next morning, all that promise had been shattered. On the 3rd of March, 1979, a resident in Glenarden, Maryland, stumbled upon a horrifying sight: a woman's body lying in a parking lot behind a building on Martin Luther King Jr. Highway. The body was later identified as Kathy Donahghue. The location, isolated and roughly 15 miles from her Arlington home, immediately raised suspicions. She had been brutally assaulted and strangled. The scene made one thing chillingly clear: this had not been a random accident. Investigators began reconstructing her final hours. They confirmed Kathy had left the restaurant in a cab after dinner, a detail that initially offered some hope, but attempts to locate the driver went nowhere. The trail grew cold quickly. Despite a thorough investigation and dozens of interviews, nothing substantial ever emerged. The violence of the crime, coupled with the complete lack of a motive or known suspects, placed Kathy's case among a growing list of cold cases that haunted law enforcement in Prince George's County. As time passed, her family and loved ones were left with unanswered questions. Years turned into decades. Investigators never stopped thinking about Kathy, but without new evidence or witnesses, progress was impossible. Then, in late 2024, 45 years after Kathy's body was found, everything changed. The Prince George's County Police Department's Cold Case Unit, in partnership with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and Forensic Lab Othram, revisited the preserved DNA evidence from the scene. With the help of forensic genetic genealogy, a tool that didn't exist in 1979, scientists constructed a new DNA profile from the sample found on Kathy's clothing. That profile led them not to a suspect directly, but to a relative. Carefully combing through genealogical records, investigators narrowed down the family tree. Eventually, one name stood out: Roger Zodis Brown. Brown, now 82 years old, was living in Pinehurst, North Carolina. At the time of Kathy's murder, he had lived in Hyattsville, Maryland. He also had a disturbing past. Back in 1967, Brown had been convicted of armed robbery in Nassau County, New York, and had served an 11-year prison sentence. He was released in June 1978, just 9 months before Kathy's death. Investigators needed proof that Brown was their man, so they waited and watched. Then, using a discarded plastic fork collected from Brown's household trash, they obtained his DNA without his knowledge. That seemingly mundane piece of plastic was sent for testing, and the results were irrefutable. The DNA on Kathy's slip, preserved all these years, matched Brown's NGAN. It was the breakthrough they had waited nearly half a century for. In March 2025, authorities arrested Brown at his Pinehurst home. He reportedly showed no emotion during the arrest: cold, detached, silent. As if the weight of what he had done hadn't followed him through the decades, he was charged with first-degree murder, rape, and related offenses. Legal proceedings began immediately to extradite him to Maryland, where he now faces the possibility of life in prison without parole. What made the case even more tragic was the fact that there was no known link between Kathy and her killer. No evidence that they'd ever crossed paths, no shared history, no motive that made sense. It appeared to be a random act of violence, senseless and cruel. For Kathy's remaining family, the arrest brought something close to peace, though the hole she left behind could never be filled. Many of her loved ones had passed away during the long wait for justice, but her surviving siblings, her brother and sister, finally had answers. They released a statement thanking investigators for never giving up. The entire Donahghue family would like to express our deepest gratitude to everyone involved in this investigation, especially the men and women in the Prince George's County Police Department, for their tireless efforts and unwavering dedication to seeking justice. We will always be grateful for their determination, their compassion, and their relentless pursuit of the truth, which has finally given us a sense of closure that we never thought possible after all this time. Chief of Police Malik Aziz echoed their sentiment, saying, "Today we took a major step towards bringing justice to Kathy and closure for her family. This case serves as a reminder that we will never give up seeking the truth, no matter how much time has passed." A discarded plastic fork helped unlock the truth that had remained hidden for 45 years. And with it came the long-awaited justice for a woman whose only mistake was trusting the wrong stranger on a night that should have been unremarkable. Kathy Donaghue's story is a solemn reminder of time, patience, and the relentless power of science to speak for the silenced.
Ruth Masters had always been a person full of promise. Born and raised in Plymouth, Massachusetts, Ruth was a woman with quiet strength and an unwavering sense of independence. A devoted wife to her husband and a caring mother to her 2 young children, Ruth was the kind of person who embodied the warmth of family and the gentleness of a peaceful community. She had a love for the outdoors, and in her free time she would often ride her bike through the trails near Miles Standish State Forest, a place she knew like the back of her hand. Ruth's family life was idyllic. She had a steady job, a home filled with love, and dreams of watching her children grow up in a world of opportunity. Ruth was the kind of woman who would never have been caught off guard by anything threatening. At least, that's how it seemed. But that all changed on one fateful afternoon in the summer of 1981. On that day, Ruth's life was tragically cut short as she was violently attacked while riding her bike down a familiar path into the woods. The family that loved her was about to experience a nightmare they could never have imagined, one that would unfold in the following months, eventually becoming one of the most haunting cold cases in Massachusetts. It was a sunny summer day, just after 1 p.m., when Ruth Masters left her home, kissed her children goodbye, and set off on what she thought would be a peaceful ride. She headed down the bike path into the woods, a familiar trail she had taken countless times before. But on this day, things were different. As Ruth rounded a bend, she came face to face with a man emerging from the shadows of the trees. In his hands, he gripped a .22 rifle, his eyes cold and intent. The man struck Ruth in the head with the butt of the rifle, crushing her skull, and dragged her body into the woods. No one saw it happen. No one knew she was missing until it was too late. As nightfall arrived, Ruth was still nowhere to be found. Her family, frantic with worry, called the authorities, and a massive search was launched the next morning. Over 100 people combed through the dense forest, canvassing 25 square miles of land. After hours of scouring the area, Ruth's body was discovered less than 150 feet off the bike path. What they found was nothing short of grotesque. Ruth's skull had been crushed and her body had been mutilated. The details of the crime were horrific, shocking even to the seasoned detectives of Plymouth. It was clear that Ruth had been savagely attacked. Her jacket had been torn from her body, and a .22 rifle magazine clip was found nearby. But even with all of these clues, the case remained a mystery. There were no signs of sexual assault and no forensic evidence that could be linked back to the killer. The .22 clip found at the scene yielded no fingerprints, and there were no immediate leads. A park ranger reported seeing a blue car with black roof racks parked near the scene earlier that day, but the car and its owner remained a mystery. As the weeks turned to months, Ruth's family was left in a state of despair. They had no answers, no closure, and no one to blame. The pain of their loss was compounded by the fear that her killer might never be found. The case grew colder with each passing day until it seemed that Ruth's death would become just another unsolved tragedy. But then, in October of the same year, a new lead emerged that would reignite the investigation into Ruth's murder. On October 1st, 1981, a young woman named Laura Lee Clark hitchhiked near Cape Cod's Bourne Bridge. She was picked up by a man who, after driving a few miles, suddenly pulled off the road and attacked her with a knife. The man, later identified as Eric Anderson, tried to assault her, but Laura managed to escape and ran to safety. She quickly reported the incident to Plymouth police. Detective George Madsen was struck by two key details from Laura's account. First, the attacker had used a knife, and second, the man had been driving a blue car, a detail that matched the description of the vehicle seen near Miles Standish Park on the day Ruth was murdered. Madsen wasted no time in tracking down the car's owner, a 50-year-old man named Eric Anderson. When questioned, Anderson seemed unusually calm and even confessed to the assault on Laura Clark, though he denied any involvement in Ruth Masters' murder. But there were too many coincidences. Anderson's vehicle, the black roof racks that matched the ones seen at the scene of Ruth's death, and his criminal history. He had served time for breaking and had been previously convicted of assault with intent to rape. Still, there was no concrete evidence linking him to Ruth's murder. As the months passed, the investigation went cold once more. Eric Anderson remained a suspect, but without proof, the police had no choice but to move on. Ruth Masters' case lingered in the files, unsolved, and Anderson was eventually forgotten. Years passed. Eric Anderson was eventually paroled after serving time for the assault on Laura Clark, but his violent tendencies did not disappear. In 1999, a similar incident occurred in Maine. A woman named Edith McKendry was attacked by an elderly man while offering him a ride. She fought him off, sustaining multiple injuries in the process. Her description of the man, along with the details of the attack, led Maine State Trooper Brian Smith to recognize the perpetrator as Eric Anderson. This time, Anderson was arrested, and it didn't take long for him to confess to the attack on Edith. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. But even though Anderson was behind bars once more, the question remained: could he be the one who had murdered Ruth Masters nearly 2 decades earlier? The cold case file was reopened, and this time Detective Rick Nagel of the Massachusetts State Police Cold Case Squad took over the investigation. Nagel spent years piecing together the puzzle. Finally, in prison, an inmate came forward with a crucial detail. Eric Anderson had confessed to the murder of Ruth Masters to him. Anderson described the attack with disturbing clarity, even admitting that he had heard someone approaching the scene and fled before he could bury Ruth's body. 3 more inmates came forward, all convicted murderers, all willing to testify against Anderson. Their testimonies painted a chilling portrait of a man whose hatred for women ran deep, and whose crimes were committed without rhyme or reason. And in 2007, after years of painstaking investigation and courtroom drama, Eric Anderson was finally put on trial for the murder of Ruth Masters. The trial was a difficult one. There was no physical evidence, no eyewitnesses, and no confession from Anderson himself, but the testimony of the inmates, combined with the circumstantial evidence, was enough to convince the jury. After 9 hours of deliberation, they found Eric Anderson guilty of murder. Anderson, now 76 years old, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was sent to Massachusetts State Prison, where he would spend the rest of his days. For Ruth's family, the verdict was a long-awaited sense of relief, but the pain of losing her would never fully go away. The years without closure had taken a toll, but at least now they knew that the man who had taken Ruth from them would never be free again. As for Eric Anderson, the killer's perspective was chillingly indifferent. In a statement made to the press, he showed no remorse for his crimes, and instead offered only a chilling reflection on the violence he had inflicted on innocent women. He had spent years evading justice, but in the end, it was the bravery of inmates, the tireless work of investigators, and the persistence of Ruth's family that brought him to justice. Ruth's case was no longer just a cold file. It was a testament to the power of perseverance, the strength of a community that refused to forget, and the unyielding drive for justice that spanned over 2 decades. If there's one thing the case of Ruth Masters teaches us, it's that justice is never out of reach, even when it seems impossible. It took 26 years, relentless detectives, and the voices of those willing to stand up for the truth to finally put Eric Anderson behind bars for good, but there are still too many cold cases left unsolved and too many families waiting for answers. If you have any information, no matter how small, about an unsolved case, speak up. Contact your local law enforcement, share what you know, and help bring justice to the victims who can no longer speak for themselves. And if you or someone you know is in danger, don't wait. Seek help, reach out, because no one deserves to be forgotten.